Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Tech Talk about SourceMap.org. Since this is an environmental talk, you're all better people for being here. My name is Ben Lindahl, and I'm an engineer in ads. I invited SourceMap to give this talk because I thought that their values aligned well with Google's. They're environmental, open source, crowdsourced, and they believe that information should be free. The presenter is Connie Kwan, the lead for SourceMap's marketing team. We also have, hopefully, via Skype, the tech lead and one of the founders of SourceMap, Matt Hockenberry. I wanted to warn you that this talk will be posted to YouTube, so please keep your comments and questions safe for the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Connie Kwan.
Hi, I'm here to talk to you about an open source project that I've been collaborating on and that hopefully you find interesting and want to collaborate on as well. For some context, I'd like to tell you why this project fascinates me. I'm Canadian. I came from Canada where there's lots of trees, and I love trees. People think I'm a tree hugger sometimes. And even though I studied computer engineering, I always thought that I'd do something in the green arena. And what green really meant to me was abstract until I started studying my MBA in sustainable management. I learned that green isn't really the right word to describe it, sustainability is, and that sustainable living defines our ability to thrive on Earth generation after generation indefinitely. And I also learned that sustainability isn't just about the environment, it's also about social and cultural sustainability. And transparency, it's the center of it all, because we cannot improve what we don't know, and we cannot improve what we don't have accountability for. And transparency provides both the knowing and the accountability. So I was searching for a project that allowed me to apply the sustainability knowledge that I have, and I came across SourceMap.org 3 months ago. It was funded by an MIT Media Lab and based in Boston. And I was very impressed with the mission of the project, which is to provide transparency to the story behind how products are made. And also, I was impressed with the visualization and how SourceMap is making the story of products very compelling. And I thought, here's a tool that really starts the conversation about where things come from, and a project that can really liberate information about supply chains. And if anyone believes in liberating information, it's Google. So I'm here to talk to you because I feel that we have a lot in common. Supply chains. We live in a world of linear supply chains where things are harvested out of the ground, they're made into products, we use the products, and then we throw it out. And a lot of information about how products are made are lost because the only information that we get as consumers is the price tag of products. And price tag doesn't nearly tell you enough about the conditions under which the products are made, the environmental devastation that can occur when you mine the products, etc. So we need to have a better system for presenting that. In the ideal world, the price tag would represent everything going into the product, but that is not the case today. And we thought that a lot of this information about products exists in the minds of many. And if only we could harvest this collective knowledge, we would know a lot more about the stories of products. So we decided to build a platform for crowdsourcing this information, and having this information available publicly would be a good start. So SourceMap.org was born. And here you see a visualization of a laptop computer and where all the parts that contribute to a laptop comes from, including lines to where they are manufactured. This map is generated using Google geolocation technology and rendered using tiling. And we have a carbon calculator on the right here, which adds up for every product that is in the laptop, the embodied carbon, as well as the distance traveled and the carbon that is associated with that distance. What's amazing about this map is the message and the impact that it has when someone finally visualizes and sees how a laptop is created. Anyone can create a map like this by logging into SourceMap and creating a profile, and they can start sharing stories about the products that they make or encounter. On the top right, you can see 3 additional features that allow people to social network using this tool. You can click on Delivered to find out the last leg. Say for Mountain View, if I want this laptop delivered here, it would add that last leg of carbon onto the calculator. You can favorite the map and share with your friends, and you can also share through QR codes, etc. And I'll talk more about that later. Another thing that's amazing about this map is there are 49 basic materials in a laptop. And it turns out 34 countries are involved in creation of this laptop. And if you think about that, that's 34 different cultures, about 20 different languages, hundreds of communities, thousands of people and species that live in the areas where the materials are harvested. And that starts putting into context the impact of purchasing and using a laptop, amongst other things that you could also map on SourceMap. So you can share the story using a map. You can also share the story using rich media. For every product or material that you add to the map, what you can do is add a picture or a video. Here is a video of tin and the mining process of tin in Indonesia. So you can do that and share the story in a more intimate way. I'd like to talk about how to build a map. We have these catalogs within SourceMap where the data is harvested from publicly available databases, and the carbon information of each of these materials are imported into the SourceMap database. And you can see here the view of the carbon catalog for parts. We also have a catalog for transportation. So by using these items as building blocks, you can generate a map very easily. If you have a custom material that you would like to add to the catalog, you can also do that and make your own building block. Now I'd like to share with you some examples of how users are using SourceMap in their everyday lives. Here is an example of a butcher in the UK who has mapped his products, his meat actually, and on the left is his particular supply chain. On the right is one of his customers using the butcher's map to map the last leg of the journey of that meat getting to him. So by having a map available, the butcher starts having a dialogue with his customers about their particular impact when they buy the meat. You can also interact with customers in the store. We use the Google Charts app to create the QR codes so that for each of these maps, so that you can put that sticker on your products and interact with the customers at the store directly. Here's an example of a hotel that is using SourceMap to take action. They have mapped where all their guests are coming from around the world, created a SourceMap and shared the story, and then they bought carbon credits for all of their guests. Businesses are also finding SourceMap quite useful. They are using it to visualize and improve their supply chain efficiency. In this example, a brewery in the UK has been using a bottling plant, which is located near the center of UK there, and shipping all their materials there to be bottled. When they mapped out the supply chain, they decided, hey, why don't we move and why don't we actually open up our own bottling plant closer to home? And that would actually save us a lot of money as well as carbon footprint and impact. So they have made a plan now to start a bottling plant further north in the UK, and they saw it as a business opportunity to expand their business. So not only are individuals finding this tool informative, businesses are also jumping in to use it as a way of starting the dialogue. So what does the future bring? Well, we'd like to do a lot more than just measuring carbon. We believe carbon is a good start because it's a very popular metric for impact, but there's also other impacts like water, forest, social impact and health impacts of communities, and everything under the sky. So we'd like to start measuring some of those things and understand what metrics could be used to measure those things. We'd like to develop more apps so that it's more accessible in the supermarket to everyday people. And we'd also like to start working on validating the crowdsourced data. Obviously, we're getting a lot of people participating, and we need to make sure that the data is robust. So we are working on research on how can we make crowdsourced data reliable. And now I'd like to introduce Matt Hockenberry, who hopefully is still online with us here. Matt, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can
Oh,
you hear me
excellent.
okay?
All right, so Matt is joining us from Boston. He is one of the founders of SourceMap.org, along with Leo Bonanni, and he is the mastermind behind development of much of this tool. So he would like to make an introduction about the architecture of SourceMap, and then start a discussion with you about any recommendations that you might have for us. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Connie. Yeah, I just want to give you a little bit of a background on some of the technical development of SourceMap and sort of what we've been up to. So this started and continues to be an academic research project, and that influences a lot of decisions we've made so far in development. But we're also strongly motivated in making this a successful open source project and trying to build from the foundation that we've created to sort of get buy-in from people who are interested in supply chains and this kind of problem. So the basic technical story is that this started as a PHP 5 app. It's derived from CodeIgniter, but we're more heavily geared now towards more modern PHP features, so no longer PHP 4 compatible or anything like that. But the basic idea is to create sort of a modular structure for sharing supply chain information. Source map objects, what we think of as source maps and what Connie shows you as source maps, are sort of the basic building block of the system. These are supply chains, but they can be nested to create sort of more complex supply chains. We have carbon catalogs that have very basic information that we can't peer into that deeply, but our primary goal is to sort of construct everything as a sort of annotated, referenced source map object. This approach that we've been trying to go with has been targeted mostly towards students because we're an academic research project, and we've been trying to sort of increase our sophistication a little bit to get some buy-in from outside developers. And most of this is written in a fairly modular way. A lot of the heavy lifting is done locally with JavaScript classes. We use jQuery, but not too much else. We have a few different areas that we've sort of gone to some pains to make a little more expandable into the future. So right now you interact with SourceMap with an editor. We think it's a pretty good editor for creating supply chains or describing supply chains more correctly in the system. But we're open to the possibility that there are other editors tailored for more specific kinds of products or kinds of purposes. So we've tried to create a modular structure so that different editors could be built to interact with the system in a fairly generic way. The same is true of visualizations. The map has been really special for us because, you think about supply chains and it seems really intuitive to me that maps are involved, but that's really not the way, a lot of people in supply chain dialogues communicate their supply chains. So the supply chain visualized as a map has been hugely transformative for these people to see. At the same time, there are other useful visualizations. We've tried to create a modular structure so we can add things like charting, get a little bit more heavily involved in sort of diagnostic analysis of a particular supply chain to see what the weak links might be with regard to certain kinds of sustainability. The same is true for the calculators that we have. Right now, we're pretty geared towards carbon because we think it's important, but it's certainly reasonable to imagine there are lots of different kinds of calculations, things like cost or customs or even sort of social measures of how different countries might interact with the supply chain if you could evaluate those in some sort of quantitative way. But on the back end, we basically just want to get all of this data and make it as open as possible. So right now we're trying to keep track of a lot of data, get a lot of data about supply chains and where things come from. Want to add rich descriptions, all the values from calculations that people produce through the website or enter in when they're creating supply chains. We also are very interested in keeping references about the data because a lot of, particularly with carbon, the data sort of a black box, and you don't have a lot of insight into why a particular value is a particular value. So an important part of our data management is trying to keep track of how a particular carbon value sort of gets stated as the carbon value. There's a lot of geo work that we're doing or trying to do with regard to SourceMap. We use Postgres on our backend, so we can use PostGIS to do some cool routing things like sort of automatically routing from point to point what a trip looks like for things. And of course, that usually involves, unless you're getting next day delivery, some sort of international shipping over a boat transport to a warehouse to a truck. And once we get all of this data, our goal is to give it away as quickly as possible so that everyone can know this information. We right now have a lot of sort of data export options. We do have an API, and we sort of favor JSON. All of our data is passed back through the app as JSON, and we also have KML exports and Atom feeds. But I mean, we do have raw data export, and if you just want to take the data or get OpenGIS access to the data and use it to say something meaningful about this information, that's part of our mission, and that's exactly what we want people to do. So I think Connie has a link. If you're particularly interested in what we're up to, what we have planned, you can check out our active development. But mostly what we want to do is just engage in a dialogue about what we could do together, or work that you guys have that relates, or what you think we should do, because one of our mottos is that we're totally open for any kind of advice, and we would love to take it. Thanks. I don't have a lot of feedback on what's going on here.
The crowd is raging. They are jumping on their seats for you, Matt.
I'm sure that's true. Thank you.
So we'd like to take any questions and make it a two-way conversation. If you have any recommendations for us or projects you think would be interesting, please let us know.
First question, Evan Parker here. I work on Google Maps. I saw a picture of an Android device. You have QR codes. I'm sure you guys are thinking about like an Android app. I'm curious if you've developed one yet, or if you have plans to develop one to read the QR code and show you a map, or maybe it's just a link, so it links back to a website.
The question was whether a Android app has been created for SourceMap.
Yeah, so the answer is sort of. We did write an Android app over the summer to sort of pilot out the idea of interacting, sort of constructing source maps as you go shopping, or getting information on products, at the point of sale. I mean, we haven't gone too much farther with that, just because, in-house our development is not so geared towards mobile devices, but we think that's an important part of the picture.
One suggestion there is to focus on a mobile web app that can be accessible, from iPhone or Android or BlackBerry. And if you don't need to have a lot of rich graphics, I think that would work pretty well. And then the QR code, it could just be a link to your site to them, and you detect the mobile web browser. Can he hear me when I'm talking? Or
I don't know. Matt, can you hear him?
No, not really.
Okay, so I have to repeat the question, which
Sorry.
I do for the recording anyway, so that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So mobile website might be a better avenue of development instead of a specific Android app.
Evan's recommending that a mobile web app is more versatile than creating a specific app for the Android.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree. And, at one point we had a phone gap, version of the site running. I mean, the only nice thing is if we had access to some, sort of rich features that, some of the web frameworks that target cross-platform devices are a little shaky on, across cross-platform devices. Things like taking pictures of the products as you get them, so we can, again, verify and annotate that information about, say, the source or the bottling plant for bottles of water, or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's sort of really nice feature, something that actually adds to SourceMap by using the mobile device. But just for access to the data, I think that's completely right. And hopefully, the sort of web app intermediary clients have gotten better. I haven't looked since the summer, but I mean, that's my preferred approach since I'm a web developer and not a mobile developer.
Who's developing for the mobile side right now, Matt? And are we looking for help with that?
We are absolutely looking for help with that, Connie. I mean, you know, we are at the mercy of MIT students here. So they come in and, you know, they get excited and they develop an application, and then sometimes they leave. And that was the case with the actual Android client that was written specifically for Android. I mean, we still have it. We're still interested in, you know, seeing if people are interested in developing just that client. I do think the web development angle is something that we can do sort of ourselves without relying on, you know, students or outside developers.
Well, the beauty is about open source is that if you don't like it, you can come and fix it. So we do welcome people to come help fix things for us.
And there are lots of, you know, great applications that already exist, things like Shop Savvy, that we could imagine, you know, hopefully taking our data or, you know, similar kinds of data to us to share that information at point of sale when consumers are looking around at the products.
Hi, Connie. I have a question about resource consumption. So different sorts of transport cost different amounts of money and consume different amounts of resources. So typically bulk sea transport is relatively cheap per, you know, kilogram per mile, for example, kilogram per kilometer. Do you have access to that sort of data, and are you possibly going to expose it so I can figure out what the transportation resource consumption is in my particular item?
Yeah, we actually have two different catalogs. The building block, I noticed you came in after I mentioned that part. So let me repeat that part. How the maps are built is based on catalogs of parts as well as transport. So we have a catalog full of values that we've imported from public databases on the carbon footprint of each product, the embodied carbon, as well as each transport. So you can ship via a freighter, and that would be lower per unit or per weight. If you ship via an airplane, obviously it's a lot worse. So you use those building blocks to make your map.
Yeah, and if I can just add, Connie, I mean, some of this, you know, like Connie said, some of this information is publicly available, but there's a lot of secret information here or proprietary data that, you know, essentially our competitors like to keep this data sort of in-house and not make their numbers very transparent or publicly accessible, which makes sense, you know, in a company maybe, but we sort of begged, borrowed, and stolen to get, you know, a lot of the data that we have, and we're really committed to, you know, trying to get as much data as possible that people will send us. We've had people literally email us who are, you know, professors or academics, carbon values and the referencing information for how they have arrived at that carbon value so that we could share it.
Hi, fascinating project, but I couldn't help noticing in your initial example that you were showing us a typical laptop computer. Yeah. Now, if I'm, you know, really interested in, let us say, minimizing the footprint of my purchases, what I really want to know is what's the footprint of this particular laptop computer, because it very much depends on how the thing is designed and built, where it gets its materials from, and so forth. So first of all, I'm a bit concerned that it's going to give me sort of rather generic answers and not going to answer my specific question. And if you do get to the point where you may be able to answer specific questions, you're then getting into all kinds of areas about, you know, proprietary information, as Matt was saying, spamming and that kind of thing. You know, if something like this took off and people started using it to make purchasing decisions, how are you going to protect the purity of your data?
Excellent question. So the question was, the laptop example that we showed is of a typical laptop. So how do we get more detailed data about specific laptops, which is more interesting? And also, how do we maintain the integrity of the data? That is a million-dollar question. We are trying to figure that out as we go as well. We are publishing typical laptop values because we don't have, it's probabilistically impossible to find every single item and where they all come from. A professor at Waterloo I was talking to, he's an LCA expert, a life cycle analysis expert, and he wrote a paper about finding where one element in a laptop comes from, and he could not nail it down. He was working with a grad student for half a year and he could not nail it down. So we know that it's virtually impossible to do. But the first step we would like to take is start sharing this information and trying to get more and dig deeper. And obviously he's two people trying to solve the problem. We're proposing a platform where more than two, 10, 20 people can start collaborating on one map and try and make it better. So we don't propose to say that even for the typical laptop example that I'm giving is accurate, but we're getting close to the reality. And then ideally, we would like to move to an Apple laptop computer. What does that look like? A Dell laptop computer. What does that look like? And then start comparing, who's doing better, who can learn from who can learn from the other, and try and improve where they mine their copper, where they get their tin. It provides a place to have a conversation about it. So you're right. We don't know yet what a typical laptop would look like. This is what we think it might look like, and we would definitely like to get to more rigor in the data, and we're looking for people to help us validate, LCA professors, to help us do some of that auditing of the data as we get it, so that we can have more robust data. And then on the website, there's a lot of sites now that are trying to crowdsource information, like Yelp, for example. They're trying to make it crowdsourced and also validated data. So we're looking at solutions there too. And maybe you guys come across something like that and have ideas about how to implement some kind of crowdsourcing and trust building app or interaction tool. And we'd love to hear about those suggestions as well.
Another question, unrelated, but have you considered the time dimension as well as location? Something I was thinking about, one of the things that often gets transported long distances is foodstuffs. And the carbon footprint of a kilo of fresh beans very much depends on whether they were harvested next door or flown in from the other side of the world, which depends on the season. So I don't know if there's any point in having a time-based view of this. If you're looking for beans in January, then they're probably going to have a high carbon footprint because they couldn't be local, depending on where you are.
Right. The question was whether we consider the time-based view, because especially for fresh foods, having it transported in from farther away may sometimes be less footprint than a local food source. So I'd like to answer. I think there are two questions there. One is the time aspect. One is foods and distance and carbon and how that all equates to each other. So let me answer the carbon question. Yes, it is definitely true that a lot of times things transported from farther away actually has less impact than things that are grown right in your neighborhood. For those measurements, I think the tool as it is has a good approximation of the information that we need to make that decision, because it does calculate the journey as well as the embodied carbon. So the energy in growing that food, which is the water necessary and the transport of that water, fertilizers, everything that you need to grow the bean, and then shipping that bean on a freighter or an airplane. So that is all calculated, and your option 2 is to buy it in your farmer's market, which you can also map that piece and say, I grow the bean in California, so it's actually more or less carbon, and then the last journey is actually really short. So it does take into account that side, but it is interesting to ask about time, because we have had conversations about, well, the tin is mined from this place today, but to be honest, next year we don't know where it's coming from. It could come from a totally different place. So the maps and when they're created start mattering. And that is something we would need to start working into the technology to make that mappable.
Yeah, just to add to that, time has been something we've, like Connie said, talked about an awful lot. We're developing now sort of better mechanisms for integrating this as a visualization tool for real business supply chains. Still mostly targeted at small business, so that as a small business develops and continues its supply chain, they can feed that data sort of more directly into SourceMap as they go. And so the time issue, particularly when we have sort of real supply chain development being shown on the site, becomes much more important.
So you just answered at least one of the questions that I had. I was going to ask about comparing foodstuffs, going into a supermarket and saying, well, I can buy this apple from Washington State or I can buy this apple from Chile. What kind of penalty do I pay for the one that comes from Chile? So that kind of feature, because I can imagine that for a laptop it's very difficult to get that data, but for a foodstuff it's actually pretty straightforward to get it, and it would be easy to make a comparison and very useful for a consumer to have that comparison, especially on a mobile device. They could quickly make a decision. But you've kind of answered that issue. So I'm going to ask another question or make another suggestion, which is that you're looking at where things come from, and that's kind of the name of your project. But in making the decisions for buying some of these things, part of that decision at least is where it goes to once you've bought it, and the footprint of the object, in particular something like a laptop, and how it's destroyed and where it goes. And that's also something which would be kind of interesting as a reverse of what you're doing, to say, well, how much carbon is going to go in disposing of this thing that I'm buying? Where is that going to? And that would be kind of interesting data as a reverse of what you're doing.
Thank you. There was a comment and a question. The comment was it'd be useful to have the comparison when you're at a supermarket for apples, say, and compare the origin of one apple to the next and see whether what my impact is for buying one apple versus the other. The question was about the end of life of a product. We're mapping where it comes from to consumption point, but then beyond consumption point, there's the trashing of the product. Where does that go? Matt, would you like to comment on whether any maps have been created on the end of life side of products?
Yeah, no, I mean, so yes, absolutely, on, comparison, and yes, absolutely on end of life. So, we do have end of life information, what you can do with certain things, in terms of what people call recycling, has different carbon attached to the process, and, sort of, different things attached to each individual process depending on the kind of material it is. And we do have data on that. What we have lost at some point early in development, like a year and a half ago, we had end of life on the site. And it is something that has not made it back on the site, in one retooling situation. And there are a couple sort of technical reasons for that, and also some data reasons for that, but end of life is important. We have information about it, and we're committed to it. The only reason why it hasn't been as pressing is that there's a lot more information about end of life, maybe not in the nicest possible way, but there's a lot less, opaqueness about what you can do with materials and what that really involves.
Yeah, I'd be curious to explore further on how we can visualize that. Obviously, people care a lot more about things getting to them at this point in time, but it is very important to me as well, the whole cycle of products, because the supply chain shouldn't really be linear, it should be circular. Things go in a circle. And, if this is a starting point for having that dialogue, but I think we can extend this tool to build on the circular aspect of products and of life. So, I'd love to have that conversation with you. If you have any ideas, that's my contact info right up there. So feel free to send me an email or come talk to me, and we can start that dialogue and figure out how we can do that mapping.
So I want to take a little step back from talking about cost and carbon footprint and stuff like that. A lot of times when I'm buying a product, I don't even know what is in the product, and I could see that with the uncertainty. Sometimes you can hear about stories of maybe toxic things coming out of China or things like that. That a business could have an incentive maybe to actually say what exactly is in their product and what their specific supply chain is. If it can prove, that the product is good, that the product is, not toxic or things like that. If it's some kind of product where there might be, uncertainty about what's actually in it, right? To distinguish your product from, say, another product that might be cheaper and kind of marketed based on, on not actually making known what's in the product. So, do you think there could be some sort of, opportunity, like, some financial opportunity, some business incentives around, exposing what's in the product to demonstrate the quality of a product?
The question was, well, there's a preamble about it. First, beyond carbon, there's also the toxicity. People talk about toys in China and other issues about products. So the question was whether we've thought about linking quality of products to this whole idea of mapping supply chains to demonstrate higher quality products compared to inferior products, and whether that is a financial incentive for companies to participate. That is an excellent idea, and thank you for bringing that up. One of my personal goals on joining the project is I find this idea really amazing, the idea of starting a conversation. And I think there is definite interest in the business world and opportunity for making a profit with this tool and with this idea. Obviously, we believe the idea should be free, or the information should be free. So we'd like to maintain an open source aspect on SourceMap. But I think you're right. The quality of products is always a question on consumers' mind, and then as well as the eco-friendliness now. So there's definitely an opportunity there to create value for profit businesses as well.
And for example, the lower levels of the supply chain, they might not normally get too much publicity. They might not be exposed directly to the consumer, but through something like this, a lower level business, can get publicity for like, say, proving, like you can show videos of how it's made and, prove that it's a quality product.
Yeah, that's definitely true. One of the challenges I've experienced in talking to business about this is they are still reluctant to make the information free. They feel like a lot of the supply chain information is proprietary. It's part of their secret sauce, and so having it online is scary for them, and sharing is scary for them. And for supply chain, which is typically the operation side of the business, is far apart from the marketing side of the business. I mean, between operations, there's still development, and then they talk to marketing. So marketing people might be more interested in publishing the story, but operations people definitely see it more as a threat. So I think getting through that cultural mindset, and that's not true. I mean, that's a generalization. That's not true of every person in operations. I've certainly talked to people who are more progressive about sharing their story, but it is a cultural mindset that we continue to bump up against, that we need to start moving towards.
Yeah, Connie, if I can just say about things like toxicity or sort of other, environmental things like, damage to animals or plants or sort of social costs. We have some information about things like this. The biggest obstacle for us is sort of finding a way to make this kind of information, in some cases, quantifiable, and in some cases, a little bit more transparent. There are lots of measures out there other than, CO2 equivalency that sort of measure impact or something like that, where it does take these factors into account, but it takes them into account in a way that you don't really know, how much of a contributor the social cost was, or how much of a contributor risks about, toxicity or hazardous chemicals being involved in the manufacture process are. So our biggest goal in moving ahead with, sort of measures like that is finding a way to make it sort of transparent, verifiable, and quantifiable.
Go ahead.
The Patagonia folks have done this thing called the Footprint Chronicles, where they've basically done the life cycle assessment process for several of their products. So it might be interesting for you guys to contact them and see how successful it's been, and whether it's, they've been selling more products because people know that, have that information.
That was a comment that Patagonia has a footprint chronicles where they publish the footprint of their products, so that might be a good source for information to
Yep.
collaborate on and put up on SourceMap. Thank you.
Evan here again. A couple things that came to mind. One is, I'm sure you guys, well, I wonder if you are aware of any efforts to get government involved in enforcing, say, providing standards and requiring that companies put this information on their products using some sort of standard. So the development of the standard and whether governments might someday be able to enforce that products use these standards. I think that'd be really cool, but obviously really hard.
That would be really cool. We're looking for people to help us talk to more people about SourceMap. I'm working on this project on the marketing side. We have Matt and Leo, obviously, in Boston. And then we have MIT students at our disposal at times. But we are trying to get more people involved and obviously more ideas, more heads on the problem. It's a lot better. So yes, we would like to talk to governments and start a standard. There are a lot of standardization bodies out there, fair trade, organic, I can fill a page full of logos with all the different logos you can put on things these days. And we're starting to talk to some of these organizations. B Corp, for example, is kind of like S Corp, but they look at eco-consciousness a little bit more. So they have a way of auditing companies that become B Corps. So I'm talking to them about how they can use our tool to do the auditing or to improve the transparency. But yeah, there's a lot of organizations out there kind of looking at the problem in different light. So we'd like to collaborate with them, certainly.
And to expand on that further, I could imagine you could define a standard in like XML for representing this data, and then companies could put it on their website, and it could be crawled and accessed in a generic way, kind of like, web search, like Google does with web search, but sort of specific to this, source map data. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I lost. What's the question?
Well, it's just a suggestion.
Yeah.
Basically, if you create a standard way of representing this data using, say, XML, then companies could put up the data for their products. Like you could imagine Apple could have a page, see where, get the data for this product, and it's an XML file. And then if there's a standard, then that encourages people to use that standard to represent the information, kind of like we use KML to represent geo information. That was a standard that was developed by the Keyhole company that Google acquired that became Google Earth. Now it's it's an accepted standard and a common way of representing geographic data. So I can imagine you guys developing a standard for representing the data on where things come from, and getting momentum behind that.
That's really cool. So the comment, Matt, is that we could create a standard, much like XML, where we standardize the way you represent the story behind products, and then we can publish that standard so that companies can participate on their own time and create maps or stories using the standard.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a very awesome goal. It would be great to be, to contribute in some way to a process like that, where we do get a standard for exposing, the real story behind, all the products and foods and, things we have.
And if no one else has other questions, I'm just going to keep going here.
Keep going.
It occurs to me that it would be great to have some pilot companies that represent their information or work with you guys. You might already have companies that you're working with to try to expose their information. Like Patagonia was mentioned as a really forward-looking company that is already actively doing things like this. And we're Googlers. We don't sell many products, but we just started selling one, the Nexus One. And I think it'd be really cool if we, on the Nexus One website, you could find out all the source map information for where the parts of the phone come from.
Would you like to get me in touch with a person who would like to draw the Nexus One map?
I'll see if I can do that.
That sounds great. The suggestion was to work with a pilot company like maybe Patagonia to map all their products online. And yes, I am actively searching for that right now as we speak.
I was curious, like you have the example up here of tin from Indonesia. If you were to also look across all the places you could get tin from, if you look at all the places you could get a raw ingredient from, which ones actually are the better places to get it from or the worst places, and what percentage of that material is coming from different sites? So that might also kind of, once you have more data in your database, might be something that can be cross-referenced that way to get a better idea of which areas are better to get that resource from environmentally.
Yeah, the comment was once we get more data on where tin is coming from in all the various places, maybe only 5 or 6, but we don't know, then it would be interesting to know which of those 6 or 7, which of those are better places to source it from. Yeah, as you know, when you get a lot of information, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. So we are trying to get more information. Yes, for each of these materials, there are usually only 5 or 6 mines in the world that will do it. And if for every material there are 6 mines, there's 7 sources you can get it. You can also get it from recycling. And then there's probably another one where you don't know about. So, but probabilistically, you can figure out the volume of those mines, and so calculate probabilistically for each laptop, how much of that material is coming from that mine. So yeah, there is a mathematical way actually to approach the data and harvest the data and create maps completely mathematically and say, oh, probabilistically, the Apple iPhone or the Nexus One is created from these mines.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, Connie. I mean, if you have a laptop, it has tin in it, probabilistically, the chances that that tin is from Indonesia is, 95%. I mean, it's tin in particular, we like to talk about because we happen to know a lot about tin and exactly where it comes from and exactly the islands where tin is mined. We're still sort of and we have a lot of data now, but the process for acquiring new data is still very hard. So, for example, finding things like tin mines, sometimes literally we're sitting there with Google Earth, zoomed in and scrolling around places where we think tin might be mined, looking for what looks like a mine. Because, it's really hard to get that information any other way.
Yeah, sometimes we are coming across conflict materials where there's mafia involved in how to source that material, in which case the mafia isn't so interested in sharing their story. So there's definite, difficulties we're coming up against, but by letting people share their story, we start getting more and more information. Well, it looks like the questions are all done here. So I'd like to wrap up this talk by saying thank you for coming. And we hope that you will join us in our quest to liberate information about supply chains. Our contact information is up there as well as our development code access URL. So please feel free to check it out. Email us, give us ideas. If you're interested in collaborating, if you know anyone else who is, please get in touch with us. Thank you.